Hello everyone, my name is Nephis, and today, as requested by some people, I'll be looking at all 10 races in ESO that you can play and how they fit into tanking. So basically we're going to be looking at each race and determining whether they're, comfortable enough or good enough for your tank. So if you're a new player coming to ESO and you have no idea what race to choose, and you're coming from an MMO like World of Warcraft or something and you have no idea what race is really good, this video is for you. If you guys don't want to watch the rest of the video and you just want answers now, I have provided a link to a spreadsheet I made ranking each race based on each scenario. So it's only going to be looking at trials. So if you're going to be looking at PvP or just in general cases, the spreadsheet's not for you. We'll only be looking at this in a PvE focus. So which race is good? Let's take a look. So again, just for the video, we're just going to be talking about the raw stats the races provide, not necessarily which gear setups you should use or what classes you should play as a tank. So for Bretons, this is our first race out of the 10 playable races in ESO. Bretons get a passive called Opportunist. It doesn't really affect anything except your lines point gain and your light armor skill line experience gain. So we're going to be skipping the first passive in every race passive tree. So the first actual passive Bretons get is that they get increase of max magicka by 10%, which is a huge bonus. So this can be good for tanking if you think you need more magicka in certain trials or dungeons. For sure, this is a very solid passive to have as a race. So if you are going for a more magicka based tank, for sure Breton may be a good way to go. The second passive for Bretons is increase of spell resistance. This is sort of a debatable passive. Is it good, is it bad? It's a bit of a mix of both. In this game, in ESO, you don't really need a lot more spell resistance because naturally as a tank, with your gear on, no matter what gear you're wearing, you usually have more spell resistance than your physical resistance. And the Bretons getting almost 4,000 spell resistance is gonna probably overreach it a little bit, but if you're gonna go off wearing medium armor as a tank, if you want to go that route, or even light armor as a tank in dungeons or whatever, then for sure this passive is also solid. For Magicka Mastery, this is something pretty unique to this race because last year the ESO developers, they removed stamina ability and magicka ability cost reduction from champion points. So for those of you who don't know what champion points are just basically extra perks we can put points into as we progress along into the game. So think of it as end game progression. And they removed that those CP perks of stamina and magicka cost reduction. So our skill cost actually went up after the Morrowind patch. So as a Breton, you still get this 3% magicka cost reduction, which is pretty nice on magicka heavy classes like Wardens and Templars. So if you want to try out Templar or Warden tanking, then for sure I recommend Bretons. This we'll be looking at is the Argonian. Now the Argonian is arguably one of the two best races for tanking PvE content in the Elder Scrolls Online. And you'll see why soon enough. The Amphibian passive, again, sort of like the Breton passive, it's kind of a gimmick. All it does is increase your swimming speed by 50%, so if there's like a water-based trial or dungeon coming out that requires you to swim as a part of a boss mechanic, then sure, this skill is going to be very useful, but otherwise, again, a gimmicky kind of thing. So the first passive, the actual passive for the race of Argonians we'll be looking at is Resourceful. So Resourceful increases our max magicka by 3%. And this is pretty nice because as a tank in ESO, you'll not just be using just your stamina to taunt things or whatever, you'll also be using magicka to heal yourself, or to also taunt since there's a magic based taunt as well, besides the stamina based one. And Resourceful also gives a second benefit of when you drink a potion, you restore 4.6k health, magicka, and stamina. So what this means is no matter what potion you use, whether it's a potion you pick up from an NPC, whether it's a potion you buy from a guild store, whether it's a potion that's like a very harmful potion that has negative effects, you still get 4.6k health, magicka, and stamina back. And this is one of the reasons why Argonians as a race is so powerful in this game as a tank. Your resource, your sustain, it's just going to be pretty good with the resourceful passive. Essentially what this means is you get the tri-stat back, and the tri-stats back, health, magic, and stamina, and you also get another special effect from a potion that normally wouldn't, give stamina, health, and magicka back to other people. So let's say you're on a Breton tank, and you drink a potion called a Potion of Lingering Health. All it does is going to give you health over time for 45 seconds. However, when you're an Argonian and you drink that potion, you get that effect, and you also get the default effect of essentially drinking a tripod. So this is a pretty powerful passive. The Argonian resistance is also a really good passive too. Increases the Argonian max health by 9%. Of course, regardless of what MMO you're playing, health is going to be a huge factor into your tank build, and the max health bonus by 9% is pretty nice. It means you can like focus less on the health aspect of your tank build if you have any. And the poison disease resistance is pretty nice too. The disease resistance could be more towards PvP, but at the same time poison resistance in PvE content in Trials, Dragonstar Arena, whatever, is gonna be there too, so this is pretty nice. The last passive, Quick to Mend, is pretty insane as well. So as an Argonian, you're going to have increased healing done and healing received by 5%. What this means is when you heal yourself and other people heal you, you'll get 5% more additional healing. So this is pretty nice on any class. Doesn't matter what class you want to tank as an Argonian, Dragon Knight, Templar, Warden, even a Nightblade. This is going to be a pretty good passive. And again, this entire race tree is part of the reason why Argonians are arguably one of the two strongest tank races in ESO. While we are on the subject of the two best races for tanking in ESO, arguably, of course, we have the next race, Imperial. The Imperial race is not part of the base game edition, so you're going to have to buy it separately from the base game edition in the Crown Store. It's going to be called the Digital Imperial Edition Upgrade. Now, don't confuse this with the Imperial City DLC. A lot of people do. You do not need to buy the Imperial City DLC to get this race. You have to just get the race by itself. Don't be tricked by this thing. Now, the Imperial is basically the Nord on steroids. The first skill, obviously another gimmick kind of thing. It increases gold gain by 1%. Not that big in the grand scheme of things, maybe. Now, the first actual racial passive we're going to look at for the Imperial as to why this makes this race one of the best races in the game to tank in PvE is Tough. So the Tough passive is fucking insane. It increases your max health by 12%. That's 3% more than Argonian, and that's a lot more than Nords. And this allows us to get away with a lot of interesting setups for gear setups. We can wear light armor, medium armor, heavy armor, doesn't matter, and we'll have a lot more health than the average, than the other races. And this can also, help us put attribute points into other resource pools. So we don't really need to have a lot into health for certain setups. We can put a lot into stamina. We can put a lot into magicka. Personally, I put every attribute point into stamina and still feel safe in Vetmov Lorkaj as an Imperial because of the tough passive. The second passive we'll look at as Imperial is Conditioning, and it increases our max stam by 10%. And it's another insane passive, another insane number. That's a lot of max stam for a tank. Again, this is basically a better version of the Nord race, and this is why, again, it lets us get away with many other setups. And also, if we don't have a setup that's stamina friendly, let's say we trait change our jewelry or whatever, and we don't have the robust traits on our jewelry, or if we have a set that doesn't give us any max stamina at all, this racial passive of Conditioning makes us feel that we still have an adequate amount of stamina to block with, to taunt with, and this is a very strong passive in addition to the Tough passive. Now, the last passive is kind of a gimmicky too. Red Diamond, it says your melee attacks have a 10% chance to restore 6% of your max health. What this means is if you light attack or heavy attack or use a melee based ability like Pierce Armor or Heroic Slash, you have a 10% chance to restore 6% of your max health. While this sounds a bit weak, in some cases it can save you, so it's actually an okay passive, although some people do want it buffed a bit. So again, that is Imperial race, and again, it's arguably one of the two best tanking races for ESO PvE content next to the Argonian. And you can have this race for any class essentially. You can have it for the Warden, the Dragon Knight, the Nightblade, and so on. The next race we'll review for tanking is the Orsimer or Orc. The first skill again, a bit gimmicky, just crafting inspiration gained by 10% when you deconstruct items. The first actual passive we'll look at for the Orc is Brawny, so increases your max health and stamina by 6%. It is a nice passive, it is a nice bonus for the max health and max stam, very useful for tanking. You always need health and stamina, and if you get it for free, even better. The second passive is increase your healing received by 5% and health recovery by 20%. Now, unless you're doing a health recovery tank build, which I don't really recommend for newer players or even most players in general, this passive is not so great. However, you do get that extra 5% healing received bonus, so this is pretty nice if you are a Dragon Knight or a Templar tank. And we have the last passive. It increases your damage done with melee attacks by 4%. And the second bonus of this passive is it reduces the cost of sprint by 12% and also increases your movement speed bonus of sprint by 10%. So it's a bit gimmicky for tanks, but you can use this for Asylum Sanctorium as maybe an Orc off tank where you can have less sprint cost reduction while you sprint to stack the minis on Olms, and you also have the movement speed bonus, which can stack with the movement speed bonus from the Swift Jewelry. So this is a pretty nice passive, very underrated now because the Swift Jewelry traits do exist, and this would be very nice for stacking things in Maw of Lorcaj or in other dungeons. However, the first bonus of the passive isn't that great, even if you're gonna be like a off-tank DPS. But again, Orc as a race for tanking, it's pretty solid. I would recommend it to newer players. However, again, comparing this to the Imperial Argonian, it's not gonna be as good in terms of raw stats. The first passive, again, not really an actual passive for combat. All it does is increase your experience gain with the medium armor skill line, and also it gives you a better chance of pickpocketing, I guess, which is kind of pretty racist. Not all Khajiit are cut purses or, thugs or thieves, but whatever. The first actual passive we'll be looking at for tanking is Nimble. Increases health recovery by 20% and stamina recovery by 10%. It's a very, very bad passive for tanking, and I'll explain why. The first reason being, in the Elder Scrolls Online, it is no longer possible for you to block and gain stam back. So basically, if you're going to be continuously blocking in a very tough fight, you don't get any stam back. So as you can see, while you're blocking cast your stamina abilities, you don't get any stam back. Only if you let go of block will you get your stamina back. So in tough situations where you may need to block a bit more and you don't have as much stamina, because you're Khajiit compared to an Imperial or even an Orc, you're not gonna really make much use of the stamina recovery. So this is kind of more towards PvP, which we're not really looking at. And for the health recovery, it's a pretty big health recovery bonus. However, again, it's not very good for most tanking setups, and I wouldn't recommend health recovery setups for newer players. Stealthy, again, not very. As you can see, it's not very good for tanking. You shouldn't stealth as a tank. You should be aggroing things. You should be taunting things. It's more or less for PvP, honestly, the stealthy passive. And the last passive is Carnage. Now this is a very interesting passive for tanks to use if you are going to go the Khajiit route like Wohler did. It's basically increase your weapon critical by 8%. This only affects, if you're strictly only tanking, this strictly only affects Vigor. So the weapon crit does affect the amount of healing you do with Vigor. Obviously, if you're going to be an off-tank DPS, for sure Khajiit is a very good race to DPS with, simply because of this weapon crit bonus. And this patch for the Wolf Hunter, you can sustain Khajiit a little better if you put Absorb Stamina on your main hand bar, as they did change a few things with the enchantments there for this patch. So again, not terrible as an off-tank DPS, which is only used in certain fights. in trials. In dungeons, you're mostly going to be strictly tanking. So Khajiit is not a very strong race for tanking, and I wouldn't recommend it if you are new to tanking in ESO or even new to the game in general. If you want to go for the aesthetics of it, for sure, go Khajiit. You can definitely tank all content on Khajiits or whatever other race. However, it's not very optimal, it's not very easy, and I wouldn't recommend it. And next we'll be reviewing the Wood Elf passives for tanking. Now again, as you're probably tired of hearing me say this, the first passive is whatever. However, the decreased fall damage is pretty nice in PvP and in some instances of PvE, so take that as you will. The first actual racial passive of the Wood Elf or Bosmer people we'll be looking at for tanking is Y'ffre's endurance. This basically increases our stam recovery by 21%. This is 11% more than Khajiit's. So basically, if you want to center your tank build around stamina recovery, which you can, but I wouldn't recommend because you do have to eventually end up blocking. This is a pretty strong passive to use on whichever class you want to tank on. Dragon Knight definitely is highly recommended for this kind of setup. You can do Warden, you can do Templar, you can do Sork tank. So this is a strong passive with pretty insane number bonus. The next passive, Resist Affliction. So kind of like the Argonian passive, Wood Elves do get resistances against poison and disease, unlike some of the other races in ESO. And we also get a max stamina increase by 6%. So basically this is kind of like a free max stam bonus, and it's nice for tanking, but at the same time the whole stam recovery thing is a bit not great. But at the same time, if you want to center your tank build around it, no problem. And the last passive, Stealthy, it increases our damage done while in stealth by 10% and reduces our detection radius in stealth by 3 meters. Not very useful for tanking at all. So honestly, you're only going to be looking at these two passes for your tank build. And overall, I'd say Bosmer is definitely one of the weakest races for tanking PvE content in ESO, but again, as I mentioned earlier, you can essentially tank on any race for most content. So if you want to go Wood Elf for the aesthetics and you don't really care about the passives and you want to just work on it, for sure, go Wood Elf. Next we'll be looking at Dumer or the Dark Elves, those nasty slavers. Now the first passive, again, reduces damage taken from environmental lava by 50%. This can actually be a nice passive for tanks, especially in certain dungeons like Bloodred Forge, where you have to go into the lava a few times. So yes, this is actually for once not a very bad passive actually. So the first actual racial passive we'll look at here for the Dumer is Dynamic. So it increases our max magicka and max stamina by 6%. So free max magicka, free max stam, and both are pretty nice to have as a tank. Make no mistake about it, in ESO as a tank, regardless of what your setup is, you will end up using both stamina and magicka based abilities, especially as a Dragon Knight and Templar and the Warden, and basically pretty much every other class like Sorcerer and Nightblade. Resist Flame increases our max magicka again by 3%, so this is actually going to be a 9% max magicka increase, which again is very nice for most trials and most dungeons. Then we get the flame resistance by 2079, so if you are a stage 4 vamp or stage 3 vamp and you are a Dumer tank, you will get reduced flame damage on you. And this is actually pretty cool because there's a lot of fire based damage in a lot of trials, like Maw of Lorkhaj has those fire kamikaze guys, AA has those fire atros, we do have Cloud Rest the Fulminate from Sororia, and we got lots of examples for it, and the fire resistance is pretty nice as a tank, especially as a vampire tank, which you most likely will be. The final passive is Destructive Ancestry. Increase our fire damage by 7% and increase our frost and shock damage by 2%. This is aimed more towards the magicka damage dealers for magicka Nightblades or magicka Dragon Knights. However, as a tank, it's again free damage, and free damage in ESO is always nice, so this will affect your engulfing and so on, which again, not too bad, but again, not really a tank passive per se, but it is again not that bad. So these two passes, Dynamic and Resist Flame, are pretty good for tanking, and I'd say Dunmer is sort of kind of in between Imperial and Argonian and the rest of the races that we have reviewed so far, like Khajiit and Wood Elf. So I highly recommend Dunmer if you guys don't have access to Imperial or whatever race you want to tank as in a specific faction, and if you don't have the, play any race, any faction pack. Now we'll be looking at the Redguard, and this is going to be a very fantastic race to look at because a lot of people use this for PvP and PvE damage dealing. So the Wayfarer passive, it's actually okay. It increases the duration of any eaten food by 15 minutes, so you're saving time on the food you eat, and you just kind of, spend less gold over time, of course, the less food you eat if you're buying food from guild stores. The second passive, or rather the first passive that we'll actually look at for the Redguard tanks, is Acceleration. Increases our stamina recovery by 9%. Again, not that great of a passive to have on the tank in ESO at the moment, but still you can work with it. The second passive, Conditioning, increases our max stamina by 10%. So this is pretty much the same as an Imperial passive that we saw earlier. It's the same 10% max stam bonus, which is pretty nice. You'll always want free stam, health, or magicka as a tank. And we got Adrenaline Rush. When we deal damage with a melee attack, you restore X amount of stamina, which in this case is 792. This effect can occur once every 5 seconds. ZOS actually has, in fact, nerfed this passive, I think, 1 or 2 times in the past because of how strong it was, and it's still a very solid passive to have, especially as a tank. So if you are a tank worried that you're not going to have as much stamina sustain or something, for sure Redguard is a solid race to have, whether you're going to tank on a Dragon Knight, a Templar, a Warden, Sorcerer, Nightblade, whatever. However, we don't have that many passes for actual tanking besides the max stam here. We don't have free health, we don't have free magicka, and our resources are going to be quite different from an Imperial or an Argonian tank in terms of resources. So it's going to be up to you whether you want more stam, but again, if you're going to go for the more stam as a Redguard, there's no point in not doing an Imperial at that point for more max health, because again, the stamina recovery for the Redguard, not that great. Same for the Bosmer, same for the Khajiit, not that great for tanks right now. So again, if you just want the max stam, and if you think your stamina sustain is going to suffer, for sure, go Redguard, but otherwise, I don't see a reason to, because it's pretty much basically like 1/2 of an Imperial. We are nearing the end here, so this is the second last race we'll be looking at here, guys, and this is the High Elf or the Altmer. Now, the Highborn passive, it's going to just be another kind of gimmicky passive, increase your experience gain by 1%, not that, big in the grand scheme of things, unless it's going to be a really, really long period of time you're going to be looking at. The first actual passive, the racial passive we'll be looking at from the High Elves is Spell Charge. It increases our magicka recovery by 9%. And in contrast to stamina recovery, which you can't get, where you can't get stamina back by blocking, you still get your magicka back while you block. So magicka recovery can actually be a very, very useful thing for tanking. And I do highly recommend the magicka recovery for certain fights. Now the Gift of Magnus, same kind of passive for the Breton race from at the beginning of the video. We're going to have a 10% max magicka bonus gain from the Gift of Magnus, and this is again pretty good for tanking. You'll always want magicka, stamina, and health, but most importantly, you always want the free max magicka, stamina, and health. So this is going to help you sustain certain skills depending on your class, like a Warden, Dragon Knight. Basically, with a higher max magicka pool, you'll be able to spam more Igneous Shields, more Breath of Life as a Templar tank, or you can do more magicka based abilities as a Warden, and so on and so on. And the magicka recovery does help, so if you want to build your tank around this magicka, these magicka passives, and you want to use the Lord Diatromons and stuff like that, then yes, that's very highly viable even in endgame. The last talent, or the last passive, excuse me, is Elemental Talent, and increases your Flame, Frost, and Shock damage by 4%. So again, this is sort of leaning more towards the DPS end of things, not really tanking. It was kind of the same case for the Dunmer passive of the same thing, except the Dunmer do more fire damage, more than the High Elves do. So this is kind of like an okay thing. I mean, again, free damage for the tank if you're going to use like an Ice Wall or a Fire or a Shock Wall. So not that bad, but also not that great at the same time. So two main passives you're going to be looking at as the High Elf tank are these two passives. You want to center your build around them. Or if you don't even want to center your build around these passives, the 10 max magic bonus is always there. The 9% max magic, the 9% magic recovery is always there, so even if you don't build much into magic recovery as a tank, you'll still have a 9% additional recovery compared to other races on other tanks. Now, last race we'll be looking at finally is going to be the Nordic race, the Nords, very popular from Skyrim, of course. So the Nords in this game in Elder Scrolls Online, which is not Skyrim, is actually a pretty good race for tanking. Now, as you can see, they have their first passive, Stalwart, and they get an increase in max stamina by 6% and health recovery by 20%. If you've watched the video, you know that health recovery is not that great, and that free max stamina is, of course, great. So this is very good for a tank race to start off with. Now we got the Resist Frost, and again we have a max health increase by 9%, which comes shy of the Imperial health max bonus by 3%. But unfortunately, the max stamina is under the Imperial max stamina bonus by 4%. This is not to say you can't tank on the Nord, obviously. It's just different raw stats. And we also get the additional bonus of cold resistance by 2079, which can be good on maybe like a few fights I could mention, like maybe dropping Hoarfrost Ice in Veteran Cloud Rest, or dealing with the second boss in PDSA. And we also have the last passive of Rugged, which increases our damage reduction by 6%. Now, it sounds really good on paper that being a Nord just instantly mitigates your incoming damage by 6%. However, after some testing, it's not a very good passive. For whatever reason, the number is actually just not that great. It does work in some cases to a slightly noticeable degree, such as in the case of tanking St. Olms in the Solemn Sanctorium or other hard-hitting bosses, but otherwise, it's not that big of a difference compared to tanking on an High Elf or an Imperial. So the last passive is not that great, unfortunately. However, the other two passives are. So if you don't have the Imperial race unlocked or anything, or if you want to not tank on a Dunmer or an Argonian, you just choose Nord, and it's actually a pretty good race. It was actually my first race to tank on before I switched over to Imperial. And that's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching this surprisingly lengthy video. Hopefully I've answered some of your questions about the Elder Scrolls Online races in regards to tanking PvE content, and I will see you guys next time. Good luck on your adventures.